Hello and welcome to another Wolfman Analytics DAX Let's Play video. Today we're going to be looking at DATEADD. So we're going to jump over to Power BI, have a play around with the function and have some fun with some DAX. Okay, so here we have a list of dates from our custom date table named dim_date. We're going to introduce a measure to test our DATEADD function, and then we're going to introduce another measure to return some sales values against the current day and against the adjusted day based on our DATEADD function criteria. So first, let's introduce a new measure to test our DATEADD function. Let's zoom in. We will call this function m1 date test. Oops. There we go. Let's create a variable. Call this date test is equal to, so we want to, for this date test, we want to return the date in the current row context. So we'll take a max of the date from the current row. So calculate, and then max of the dim date, which is the same value that's being returned in our table. Close the calculate function, return from the variable block, and we want to return date test. So let's add this measure to our table, and as you can see, the test has worked and we are returning the same date from our row in our row context, which is great. So let's introduce another measure which will return the sales, the net sales value sold on that particular date. So there's no date adjustments on this one. This is just for testing purposes only. So we've got a point of reference. So a point of reference with our sales information. So let's introduce a new measure. We'll call this M2 sales value current, and let's start our variable block. Let's call this V sales value is equal to calculate. So we're taking the sum of our sales value, which is in our order lines table in this scenario, order lines net sales value, and there's no additional criteria we want to add to this calculate function. We just want the sales value for the current row context. Let's return out of our variable block and add return the variable V sales value. So let's add this to our table. Okay, no data is returned in December. Let's scroll down. Okay, some values have started to be returned up to the 30th of September. Simple reason for that is there's no data after the 30th of September. So that's fine. I'm happy that that's returning the result that we want. So this is our point of reference here. So 30th of September is the last data entered into this table. So let's introduce a new measure and we can try out our DATEADD function. So the purpose of the DATEADD will be in the current row context, we can move what values being returned So in this case, the sales value. So we could, in the current row context, let's say at the start of the month, or in this case, the end of September, the 30th of September, we want to know what the sales value was for the day previous. So, oh dear, I lost my measure. Bear with me. Let's add a new measure. I'm going to call this M3 sales value adjusted date. Take no notice of this naming convention. it's not something these are not names I would usually follow. I'll try and, but they're a bit long for my liking. But I'm not going to think too much about them on the fly in this case. So our variable block is opened. What we're going to call this variable v sales value adjusted equals calculate. So we want to take, this is the same calculation as the previous measure. We're taking a sum of the net sales value. Let's just finish this off here. Close the variable block. Oh no. Yep, the syntax is incorrect because I haven't finished typing it yet. Want to return v sales value adjusted. Okay, so now that's fine. We're not getting any errors returned on our third measure, but now we want to introduce our DATEADD function. So in the calculate function itself, we're taking a sum of the order lines net sales value. Where we've got the filter conditions, this is where we'll add DATEADD. So the criteria that we need to add, so what do we need? We need dates. So in this case it will be the dates from our dim date table. Dim date table. The number of intervals. So let's just go back to the previous day, so -1, and our interval itself will be by day. Okay. So let's go back over this this function. The DATEADD wants to reference what column it's pulling the date from, how much we want it to move by, and the interval. In this case, it's going to be day. So let's check to see if we've got any errors on this measure. We haven't. So let's add this measure to our function, our table, and as we can see, let's zoom in. The 1st of October is referencing one day previous, which is the 30th of September. So we can see we've pushed everything back by one day. So that's great. So we could do a comparison now of the current date versus the previous date. And actually, while we talk, let's not just talk about it, let's do it. Let's introduce a new measure. So what do we want to do? We've got two values that we want to compare against each other to see how much of a variance there is. So let's call this M4 measure compare. So we've got two variables in this case. The first is going to be our current date, our current value, sorry, our sales value based on the current date, but let's try and shorten that a little bit. So V, let's just call it current value. Whoops, that equals is not in the right place. So here, we're not going to build out exactly the same function. We can just reference the measure, not function. We're not going to build the same measure again in this measure. We're just going to reference the measure. So the measure in question was M2. Now we're going to have another variable, which is the adjusted date. So V, adjusted value in this case. So which one was this? It was M3. And now we want to do a comparison against, let's just do one minus the other. So the result of these will be var v result equals v current minus v adjusted. So what will this return? So the current value minus yesterday's value. Okay, so we want to close the variable block. And we want to return v result, which is the comparison of one value against the other. So, check we've got any errors on that. No, we're good. So let's add that measure to our table. Okay, let's look at the results. What have we got? Sorry to jump around. So let's look at the 29th of September. So on the 29th of September, we had £63,000, 63,000 units of sales. And on the previous day, we had 94,000. So we had a drop of sales of £31,000, which is what's reflected in M4, our measure. So that's super. Everything seems to be working great there. And that feels like a really good use of DATEADD. Now, you can get creative now, and it doesn't have to be the previous day. It could be the previous year. It could be the previous month. It could whatever range you want to do a comparison against is you can see in if we go back to M3. Let's zoom in on M3 actually. Let's just test this. So we have our values. Can we see our values? Yep. So if we did this 2 days previous, yep. So I'm just looking at to make sure this is calculating properly. So we're looking at the sales 2 days previous now. So 101,000 on sales on the 30th of September. 2 days prior to that, we had 94,000. So there was a increase of 7,500. Yep, that's working great. So like we said, you can do whatever you want to do with this now. So let's look at the previous month. Let's change our interval to month. You can see everything shift around. So 71,000, sorry, I'm looking at again the 30th of September. So for the previous month, there was £71,939 worth of sales. So that was on the 30th of September. Let's go back and find, so this should be the 30th of October, £71,931. So there we go. doing a comparison for the previous month's date. So that's pretty awesome. And a really common use of this will be year, when you're doing year-on-year comparisons. So performance against this year compared to last year. But obviously, you wouldn't be doing it by, well, it's not obvious, but the user requirement here would probably not to be doing this by date. If you were doing a year-on-year comparison, you might want to do it by year or by month. So let's see what happens actually. If we change the iterator, what the values are iterating against, to something a bit broader than date, let's see what happens. So what do we want to do? Let's remove date from our table. And let's introduce, let's put year in. Aha, this is interesting. Okay. Right, so let's just get everything in order before we start. Pardon me. Before we start testing, I'm just going to take this date test out of the table for now. I'm confident in what's being returned, or what is being returned is the correct value. So we don't need the date test in there anymore. So what's interesting here is that we've got our years. So 2023, 22, 21 and 20. And then we've got a number of blank rows in here as well. So we're not covering off blank rows in this video, but it's always interesting when you look at a data set and then when you get blank rows returned and it's like, okay then. So is this a problem with my data set? Or so the underlying issue here is that there's no relationship, or rather the data that sits on the many side of this on the many side of the relationship between our dim underscore date table and our sales line table. There's no association between the some of the dates that are in the sales order line table back to the dim date table. So that could be a problem with the data, but that's something for a separate video to understand why we're getting blank rows returned. So there's not an insignificant amount of blank rows there either, £7 million worth. But for the purposes of this video, let's stick with the information, the calculation that we want to perform, which is current year versus last year. So as you can see, 2023 we had £16 million worth of sales, and in the previous year we had 18.7 million pounds worth of sales. So that in the comparison, we are 1.9 million pounds down on sales compared to the previous year. So that is a pretty awesome calculation. Now, those with a eye for detail would probably say that we haven't got to the end of 2023 yet. So when you're doing a date comparison year on year, you would want to have a full data set in there, and you would be correct in saying that. So for something like that calculation, we would want to do year to date compared to previous year to date, which would make for another good video. So perhaps we could do that in a separate video. But for now, this is great. This seems to be working fine. And I think we could leave it there. There is an alternative actually. Let's just briefly cover it off. So the alternative view, or rather the alternative function, is parallel period. So what we'll do is I'm just going to take a quick copy of a measure we created in M3, and I'm going to add a new measure. What are we up to? M5. Let's call it parallel period test. So what we're going to do, we're going to remove this DATEADD function here. And we're going to use the parallel period. So parallel period pretty much asks for the same information: dates, number of intervals, and the interval itself. So let's just add that in. So date, which is our dim date date. The number of intervals is 1. So the key difference here is parallel period doesn't let you compare days. It only lets you compare months, quarters, and years. But for what we want to do here, we are comparing against year, so that's absolutely fine. So let's go back to our table. Let's come out of our measure, make sure that everything's got no errors. Yeah, we've got no errors. Let's add that measure M5 to our table. Put it next to M3 so we can double check. And as you can see, the values are exactly the same. So what's the difference between parallel period and DATEADD? I'm interested to know what the difference is. Should we open up DAX Studio? There's another query. We don't want that query. Let's get rid of that. Let's add a new. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to define a measure. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just going to copy the measure from here just to save a tiny bit of time. I'm going to define. Can you see that okay? Define measure. Our measure is going to be called underscore measures. Let's call it measure test. So our measure test, I've just pasted in the measure that we created. Zoom out a little bit, tidy up the syntax. So that's returning the measure. Now, obviously with DAX Studio, we need to create a table. So let's, what do we want to do? Okay, so evaluate. So summarize what we're doing. We're doing dim date, and we were returning dim date year. Let's replicate the table that we had in Power BI. Okay, that's returning all of our years. So now let's add our measure. So we want to wrap our summarize with a add column. The column we're going to add, we'll call it actually let's properly replicate this. So the first column can be our sales value, which is the true sales value against the current date. So let's go back and put I'm going to copy this measure. Oops. So this first measure I'm going to call sales. So M1 sales value. I'm going to take out the DATEADD. So this is just this first one, M1 sales value, is just returning the net sales value against the current row context. So let's double check that this is working. So add columns. So against our summarized dim date, which is returning dim date year, we want to add a column called sales value. And we want to return the result of this measure in the current row context. Let's run that. Okay. So there's no data for years previous to 2020. So save having to reorder these columns every time. Let's put an order by, let's put a bit of syntax at the bottom. Order by year descending. Let's rerun that. Okay, so that's starting at 2023, going backwards. So there's our sales value. So that's our baseline. And M2. So this is our adjusted value. So this has got a DATEADD dim date -1 year condition as part of the calculate function. So what we're going to be doing is turning on server timings and checking to see the speed difference between using dim date, DATEADD and parallel period. So this second measure will be our adjusted value, and this is based off of this measure. Run that. So our adjusted value is returning the information for the year previous. So this is the fun part. Let's turn on server timings. This is always the fun part. And server timings are on. Let's run it and see how long it took to run. 7 milliseconds. So in case you haven't used DAX Studio before, we're looking down here. Our total time to run was 7 milliseconds. Okay, so let's go back. Comment out this bit, but let's also put a comment in to say this was 7 milliseconds. Now let's try parallel period against dim date dates. We want a -1 year. in capitals. Let's run that. 18 milliseconds. How about that? 18 milliseconds. Okay. So I'm going to rerun that. Oh, I've rerun it. 7 milliseconds. Run it again. 10 milliseconds. So what did we have? So it seems to be hovering around 7 milliseconds. Run it again. So we've got 7s and 10s. 7s and 10s. That one was just like 7, 10, 8. Yeah, okay. Let's go back to our date add. So parallel period was hovering a 7s, 8s, and a couple of 10s. We had that one anomaly. Let's forget about that one for the time being. Let's be fair to parallel period. Let's run date add. Okay, 10 milliseconds. 7 milliseconds. 7. 10. Well, they're exactly the same. But wasn't it fun to find out that they're exactly the same? So not only do they look the same, they act the same. So let's draw this to a conclusion. DATEADD. So in your current row context, you can move the values that you're returning against that row context. You can offset by date. So in the context of, if it's a year, you can offset by a certain amount, go forward or backwards, by month, by day only for DATEADD, not parallel period. Also by quarter was in there as well. So it's a really, really useful function. There's no speed differences between DATEADD and parallel period, which is interesting. So yeah, have fun out there with DATEADD. So if you like this video, please drop a like on the here, and or if you feel like I need some feedback, or if this is like too long or anything like that, please drop me a comment. I like to hear from people. Harsh criticisms, good criticism, nice criticisms, good criticism, and praise is lovely as well. So yeah, if you like this work, then you can also go to wolfman.uk and you can have a look at some of the other stuff that I've been doing, articles to do with Power BI. There's some more DAX Let's Plays on there. There's another series called Let's Think About, where take business scenarios, specific requests that you may receive, and explore kind of different solutions to those business requests. So yeah, have fun out there. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.